Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Adam Byfield is Principal Technical Assurance Specialist at NHS England. His job involves providing ethical assurance for technical systems which are used in the NHS, including those which employ artificial intelligence. It's well known that AI, as well as providing some really exciting benefits, raises some distinctive ethical issues. But it was really interesting to talk to somebody who's at the sharp end of trying to address these issues. How do you test AI systems in a healthcare setting? What are you looking for? What kind of assurance can you provide to patients and the public? I'm really grateful to Adam for taking the time to talk to me about this really important topic. So Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we're going to talk about assurance of AI systems in a healthcare context, because that's your role, right? So could you tell us a bit about what your job is and what it involves?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked for the NHS for 11 years this year. And I am an assurance manager. So what that typically entails is that I run small teams and we assure national IT systems or data collections for the NHS. Typically, we are assuring that the system that's been built is the system that was designed, so that the real system matches the system on paper. And for the last 3 years, kind of alongside that, I've been running a small project to look at how we can deliver that service for AI systems as well.
Right, okay, brilliant. And you're at NHS England, is that right?
That's correct, yes. So we were previously NHS Digital, but we've recently merged into NHS England.
Right,
so,
okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. As I say, we're going to talk about AI systems and the way they're used in NHS context and kind of what the issues are that the use of those systems raises and how one might try to kind of mitigate those issues and so on. So I wondered if you could just start by giving us a few examples of the way AI is actually used within the NHS, because I guess possibly many listeners might not kind of be familiar with the way that NHS is using AI systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very broad church. I think a key difference with AI to more traditional tech is that so for our traditional systems are often national systems that developed centrally and then kind of rolled out. With AI, it's much easier for individual trusts to develop their own tech locally.
Right.
And so that's led to lots of innovation, which is great. But also, just a much broader variety and array. I think you could probably split them roughly into two categories of administrative and clinical. So the administrative AIs are things where we are exploiting the data that we've got to kind of improve productivity, things like that.
Right.
So a couple of examples of that. I worked with a trust a couple of years ago who had developed a readmissions predictor. So they were looking at the data they were capturing on their A&E admissions, basically. They had a cohort of people whom they referred to as their frequent flyers, who were often in A&E. That trust had quite a limited set of resources for outpatient support, and they wanted to target that as effectively as possible. So they used a risk stratification AI to look at that data and to basically try and predict who was most likely to end up coming back into A&E, so that they could then target their outpatient resources at those people and hopefully prevent that readmission. Okay. Similarly, there are parts of the NHS where people who've used services can leave written reviews of those services, and those reviews would then be published online. Before they can be published, however, they need to be moderated. There are certain rules around what we can publish, and again, that can be you can use a natural language processing AI to apply those moderation rules as well. Those are examples of administrative AIs that are using data.
Yeah.
The other side is the more clinical. I think this is probably what people think of more when they think of this.
Yeah.
So the directly clinical stuff. So there's a lot of computer vision AIs of looking at scans and diagnosing. I was at a conference a couple of years ago where there was a presentation on looking at a computer vision AI that was looking at making Parkinson's diagnoses. So that was interesting. During lockdown, a lot of people who would have attended assessments in person had to do so via video instead, obviously. That resulted in these clinicians suddenly having this big bank of videos of people who potentially had Parkinson's. And so then we were able to use a computer vision AI to start trying to make those diagnoses as well.
Right. So that's really fascinating. Is that so? I kind of heard about this case actually. So is it to do with gait analysis? Is that right?
Yeah,
so it's kind of the way people walk, and the AI
yeah.
looks at video examples. And
that's right. Yeah. So the neurologist said that there are some times when he can actually make a pretty good guess as the patient walks into the room. Yeah. Literally. But more specifically than that, what they tend to do is they would ask the patient to perform a series of simple physical actions. So tapping forefinger and thumb together repeatedly, things like that. And then you're looking for particular tics or particular signs.
Right.
And then, so it's effectively pattern recognition. And so, you could develop an AI that can try and do that.
So in that case, the neurologist is kind of using judgment, but essentially what they're doing is they're kind of subconsciously, I suppose, processing like loads of examples of patients with Parkinson's that they've seen before.
Yes.
And they're just recognizing that pattern and they're just kind of immediately seeing that is a patient who has Parkinson's.
Yeah,
and the idea is that an AI can, through kind of a machine learning process, can mimic that.
Yes, potentially. And I think, he was, that particular clinician was quite evangelical about AI. He was very enthused about it. He was adamant that medical diagnosis is pattern recognition, and AI, that's what AIs are good at. So he's, and he felt that actually that AI had the potential to be able to spot things too subtle for him to see. So hesitations in motor function that are too small for him to see, the AI might be able to flag that. So doing what he was doing and perhaps a little bit more.
That's really interesting. And I was, interested in what you said a bit earlier about how a lot of this stuff is being developed locally in different trusts. Is that right? So
absolutely.
Does that cause problems for you as a central person trying to assure these systems? Because it strikes me that I think the IT department in this university, and in all universities, has problems with things like that, because you've got all these different academics departments and they all want computers to do different things, and they're all kind of buying their own tech and stuff, and then it becomes a nightmare to try and make things secure and safe and so on. Do you have a similar problem? The NHS is just a vast organisation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, fifth biggest employer on the planet, as we often say. So just to give a sense of scale, it is vast, yeah. It's not necessarily a problem in that sense, in that trusts do have a lot of independence, quite rightly. So trusts, when they develop their own systems, AI or not, will have their own processes to assure. The traditional route, as I say, is that if it's a national system, that would come through us automatically, so it would get assured before it's rolled out.
Right.
AI is still a relatively new landscape, so the regulatory framework is still being developed.
Yeah.
There's currently nothing that would compel a trust necessarily to come through us. As I said, they'll have their own safety processes. But certainly what we've done in our project is make ourselves available to them. So we've been approached by trusts who have asked for support. Mm-hmm. I think it's, at the moment, that's more how it works, in that we are a resource that they can access if they wish.
Yes, yeah. And do you kind of have to think about yourself and like what the kind of general aim of your role is, I suppose, in a way? Because I suppose I could imagine that you might be perceived as, well, here's somebody who's going to tell us what we're not allowed to do or whatever. And
absolutely, yeah. So that's not an AI thing; that's an assurance thing generally. There's an interesting one of the software testing qualifications that we would typically undertake to do this role has a module on the psychology of testing, and looks at the difference between the psychology of a developer versus the psychology of a tester and assurer. And it's very much that, a developer would assume that what they've done is right unless they see otherwise.
Yeah.
A tester and assurer will assume that there is something wrong until they've satisfied themselves that they're not. So typically those relationships often begin with, as assurers, we need to kind of prove our worth, basically. So sometimes there can be some of that reluctance to start off with, particularly if people are under pressure to deliver and feel like we're potentially slowing that down. However, as soon as we're able to start adding value, then generally people recognise that. There's a concept called the cost escalation model, which basically just says, if a defect was found on paper in a design and it took you an hour to fix, that same defect will probably take you 10 hours to fix if you don't spot it until development, and perhaps 100 hours to fix if you don't spot it until after it's gone live. So there's huge benefit to identifying issues as early as possible. And so that's often the value that we would add of saying, actually, we found this now, which prevents you from having to deal with it later. So,
okay, great. One thing I was interested in, I wonder whether you have a kind of view on this, because obviously your experience is within the UK system, but I just wondered if there's any kind of distinctive benefits or challenges presented by the fact that we have a nationalised healthcare system in the UK? I mean, can you imagine what your job would be like in, say, I don't know, France or America or somewhere where they don't have the same kind of system?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly from an AI development point of view, there is just an enormous benefit of having a single centralised healthcare system. So the NHS is, to my knowledge, pretty unique globally. I think there are similar systems in other countries, but not quite the same. So to develop an AI, the key thing to start off with is that you need data with which to train the AI. And so typically what you want is as much data as you can get, so volume, but also you want coverage. So you want that data to include all the scenarios that you need the system to deal with. So the huge advantage that we have is because we have a single healthcare system, our data assets cover basically the whole population. So in America, you might have a private healthcare provider who might, their data may well cover far more people than live in the UK, for example. They might have 100 million people on their system. However, that is a subset of the population. So if you trained an AI that you wanted to deploy nationally, your data wouldn't have the full coverage.
Right.
So for us, because we have these data assets that are that cover the whole of the population, even though they're potentially smaller, they have approximately 100% coverage. And so if we're training an AI using that data, we can have the confidence that it's actually covering all the types of people it might encounter. So what that means is that the data that the NHS holds is vastly valuable from a technical point of view for AI development. It's an incredible and unique resource. Also makes it very commercially valuable as well, because as I say, I'm not aware that there's anywhere else in the world where you would have a data set that covers an entire nation's population.
Yeah.
It's very important. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Maybe we can start to talk about some of the ethical issues then that using AI in health contexts raises. So, and maybe actually if we just take the examples that you gave a few moments ago, to kind of highlight what some of the issues might be. So you kind of gave I suppose an administrative example where people in a accident emergency department might be trying to predict how likely people are to be readmitted and so on. And then there's the Parkinson's example as well, which was really interesting. So what do you think are the main ethical issues that you'd be looking for in both of those cases?
Sure. So I think in terms of ethical considerations, I think the content of the training data is the key thing in terms of does that training data cover all the people who are going to access the service? So the AI only knows, just doing air quotes there because AIs don't know anything, but the AI only knows what you tell it. And so when you are training it, if you don't show it examples of certain groups of people. It won't necessarily know how to deal with them. And so subsequently, those people will receive potentially a different, probably a worse service from that system, for example. So with the A&E readmission predictor, one of the things we did when looking to show that was to analyse the data on which it was trained. So what we're looking for there is instances of bias, and these would either be what we'd call scenario bias, so that is the situations you want it to deal with, but also demographic bias. So in that one, it was interesting because we did identify that there was demographic bias in terms of it was skewed towards an older population, it was skewed towards particular ethnicities. However, we also identified that this AI was being applied to that cohort of people specifically. So when we assured it, what we said was, as long as you use it for those people, then that is appropriate because it's tailored to that group of people. We would not assure it if you tried to use it for other people from different communities, for example.
Right. Okay.
You would need to retrain to do that effectively.
Right,
so in that particular place, there was a children's hospital nearby that meant that actually they had a skew towards older people coming to them because younger people went to the other hospital.
Sure.
And the older people were the people who were more likely to be readmitted. So it was a question of identifying the bias and then deciding if the bias was appropriate. But the key thing would be that was a fantastic innovation by that trust. It was wonderful. So you could imagine that is exactly the kind of thing you might want to pick up and roll out more broadly.
Yeah.
However, from an ethical point of view, if you want everyone in the country to get the same benefit from that, you would have to retrain that so that it covered all of those people.
So I suppose the impact on patients of that, if you didn't kind of pick up and address that bias, would be something like you might be missed by the system if you're from an ethnicity or an age group or whatever it is.
Exactly.
That hadn't been adequately trained on.
Yeah, and I suppose in that specific example, the long-term outcome of that would be that, as I said, that was about trying to allocate their outpatient resources as well as possible. So you could imagine, that if a particular community, a particular ethnic group wasn't covered by that, then maybe that AI never predicts that those people are going to come back. So those people end up further down the list for getting that outpatient resource, So yeah, and I think that's a key thing for us in terms of it's quite easy for us to be quite detached from the front line if we're not careful because we're a couple of steps removed, but we're always quite cognizant of what is the frontline impact on patients ultimately, because that's why we're going to work every day.
And might there be a danger of a similar effect in the Parkinson's example as well? Like if it had only been, I guess maybe if it had only been trained on kind of older patients, it might miss people with early onset Parkinson's or something.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the key thing about AIs, and one of the big challenges for assuring them, is that they're what we call black boxes. So what that means is we can't effectively look inside them, and we can't know explicitly how it is making the decisions it is making. And so what that means is you have to focus quite a lot on inputs and outputs, basically, because you can't see what's in the middle. And so, we can't assume that we've necessarily covered everything. We can't assume that the things we think it's looking at are what it's looking at. So and I mean that is a good example in that the data set that was collected to train that AI was collected, well, almost by accident, as I say, because it was, just people having to do video calls during lockdown. So that wasn't a data set that was specifically compiled and designed to have coverage. It was just a kind of incidental data set. And so, it would be an enormous fluke if that happened to perfectly cover everything.
Yes.
So yeah. And as you say, it would probably be older people. I suppose depending I don't think I actually know exactly where that was geographically, but it would be skewed by the local population as well, so yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so bias looks like it's going to be a big issue.
Absolutely.
What else is there? I mean, is privacy going to be part of it? It strikes me that with that, again, with the Parkinson's example, you've got videos of actual people, right? So can you anonymize videos where you're actually using it to...
Yeah, so that is a challenge. I mean, I think the assumption, certainly until recently, the assumption has always been that that from the training data going in at the front end, if you like, to things coming out of of that back end, that it's impossible to kind of untangle those and get back to an individual.
Right.
So there's been an assumption to say privacy is not really an issue because you're one of, as I say, you want as much data as possible, so you probably like to be one of a very large number of people. And the AI is not interested in individuals,
Sure.
It's looking for trends. More recently, that's been looked at more closely in terms of whether it is, particularly when we talk about what we call malicious actors, so hackers and stuff.
Yeah.
Is it possible to pull that out? So that's been looked at currently. But I think it's one of those things where I suspect that's probably something that the public are most concerned about. It still seems to me to be relatively low risk.
Right.
But what I would say is that although the AI work is relatively new, it sits within long-established traditional structures, and we are incredibly tight on data protection and privacy anyway.
Yes.
So regardless of whether it's been used for AI or not, there are a lot of checks and balances in place to specifically protect people's data. Yeah.
I was going to say, it seems like privacy and confidentiality are areas where, we are just more heavily regulated than we are
absolutely
for things like bias, right? So is there kind of regulation covering bias as well, or are you just applying your own standards?
Yeah, so at the moment we've kind of taken the initiative to innovate so that we can respond to these challenges as they appear. There are currently various agencies working on regulatory frameworks, so that is coming. As of today, there isn't a big established regulatory framework, but there's a huge amount of work going on in that area, and a lot of it seems to be in the same direction. Okay. So, yeah.
Great. Okay. So bias, privacy, anything else? Are there any other kind of ethical issues that come up a lot? Or
I think bias is the key one. I mean, another thing that we've looked at, which I believe might be unique to our project. So we're looking at natural language processing AIs, and in particular text-based ones. So this probably the most common example of these would be chatbots. If you're on a website or an app and there's a chatbot to advise you. So we'd started looking at what we've called literacy bias in terms of, so we've developed some techniques by which to try and assess, is there a point at which your level of literacy is low enough that you now start to get a different service?
Right.
The chatbot can't understand you. So
does
that potentially, could we identify a cohort of people and would say, well, actually, those people either can't access this or don't get the same service from it due to their level of literacy.
Yeah.
So that's also bias, but that's bias at the user end.
Yeah. That's interesting. Is IT literacy part of that as well? It kind of strikes me that when I am conversing with one of these chatbots, I'm aware of kind of broadly what a chatbot is, and I'm kind of tailoring my responses a little bit to make sure that, do you know what I mean? It gives me a meaningful response, but maybe that might not be possible.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. There's two ends to that. I suppose the people designing the chatbot are always going to aim to try and make it as human-like as possible. Yeah. So the technical architects and the developers would probably say, you shouldn't need to. Yeah. You shouldn't need to do that because it should be accessible. Yeah. I mean, as I say, there's, in lieu of formal regulation being in place yet, there are lots of other things around. So Microsoft have got I think it's a 10-point list of kind of good practice for chatbot development. And one of the first points on that list is the user should know that they are talking to a chatbot, not a person.
Right.
That's a really clear thing. So on the one hand, the people designing the chatbot are going to try and make it as much like a human as possible for your benefit to interact with it. But at the same time, it is reasonable, I think, to make it clear to people that you're not talking to a person.
Yes.
And then in theory, over time, as they improve, it should be harder and harder to tell, I guess. So
yeah, but is that one of the things? So as that becomes the case, would you then want it to be made more explicit that this is an AI that you're talking to rather than a human, so as not to be deceiving people?
I think that's important. Yeah, I think that's. I think from a practical point of view, but also from an ethical point of view, I think it's important to be. I think transparency throughout all the AI assurance stuff we've done. I think transparency is one of the key themes, so that people understand what this system is and that they're interacting with. Yeah, and I think one of the other suggestions on that list as well is having a kind of an escape route,
right.
so that you can actually talk to a person. So I think that's an established thing if you think of phone systems that you interact with as well. Having that route of going, actually, this isn't working for me. So if for some reason, literacy or, as you say, technical literacy or anything like that, if there's a reason why you're finding you can't access it, we should accommodate that through an alternate route of an actual person.
Yeah. Okay, great. And so your job is to assure these systems. So how does that work? I mean, so first of all, kind of where should we be setting the bar for AI? So when you're assuring these systems, like how ethical are you looking for them to be? Or
that's a fair point. I think that's a really good question because I think it's one that doesn't get identified often. I think it's one that's kind of ignored. So I think a lot of the time, because it's technology, I think there's an unspoken assumption that the bar should be perfection.
Yes.
So this should be perfectly ethical. I'd be interested in your thoughts as to whether that's even a thing, right? is that a thing? I think certainly from our point of view in terms of assurance, the idea that's not only an unreasonable aim, but not a particularly useful one either, really. So I think a much more useful bar would be just compared to a human. So you would. I think from my point of view, I would say, as a rule of thumb, I would say, okay, I expect this to be at least as good as a human. Yeah. But bearing in mind that, we have, we trust clinicians to make decisions, but those clinicians are human beings.
Yes.
So they're not perfect either.
Course, yeah.
So yeah. I mean, I think there's an interesting point around the training data for AIs. So if we think about computer vision AIs that are looking at scans, for example, in order to train those AIs, we need to feed it loads and loads of scans. Those scans need to be labelled. So we need to be able to say, that scan shows cancer, this scan shows no cancer. We need to tell it what we call the ground truth, so the actual reality. We need to tell it that.
Right.
Those labels have to come from clinicians in the first place. As I say, you want a huge volume of data as well. So if I've got 250,000 scans that I need labelling, I'm not going to get one clinician to sit there and work through those, sure. Right? So these are typically going to be done by loads and loads of clinicians in bits. There'll be a variety. So one scan, right. You might have this clinician might say, yes, that's cancer.
Yeah.
That clinician might say, I don't think it is.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good example of even the fundamental way in which you're training the AI in the first place is limited by human opinion, human ability.
I was going to say, how can you ever get it to be better than clinicians if it's being judged against the judgments of clinicians? Right.
So I mean, you can potentially improve a little bit in terms of by volume.
Yeah,
because you're averaging it out over time and stuff. But that's what we call label noise, so that even the labels themselves can't be completely perfect.
Right.
So I think in terms of that bar, the bar should be the human.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose one difference though might be if you receive kind of poor treatment by a human clinician. if they do something that looks unethical, like it's biased or something like that, there's potentially some recourse there, right? There's some accountability that human has. They're a professional, they're regulated and so on. You could potentially make a complaint and so on.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about an AI system that's a black box, that accountability looks like it's not there. So, I mean, is that something that you need to worry about?
Yeah, so that is a really interesting topic at the moment.
Yeah.
That's not been fully resolved, but the issue of liability is quite a hot topic in terms of if an AI makes the wrong decision, who is liable for that then? I think the big safety net for that at the moment is so certainly to my knowledge, there are no AIs that are making significant clinical decisions on their own.
Yeah,
that's just not a thing.
Yeah.
So typically, those the computer vision AIs that I'm talking about there that might look at a scan and say cancer or not cancer, those have been used to advise clinicians. The decision is still ultimately the clinician's decision. So it's still a human making a decision. It's a productivity tool. It's not replacing a trained clinician,
Right.
So you would still have that recourse in that sense. But no, the issue of liability is, well, is it the people who built it?
Yeah.
Is it the people who are using it? And that is tricky. So certainly in terms of our assurance, I mean, is it us? If we've assured it,
right,
are we liable?
Yeah.
So certainly the way I've developed our assurance approach there is that we are incredibly specific about the use case for which the system is assured. So saying this is assured, but it's only assured if you use it in exactly this way. So, I mean, for example, there was a computer vision AI developed in the US a few years ago, appeared to perform wonderfully, and then was rolled out in America, and suddenly, from being kind of high 90% accuracy, suddenly dropped down to being in the 60s. And what they'd found was that when they developed it, they had exclusively used scanners made by one manufacturer. And as soon as you started using this with scanners from different manufacturers, it didn't work.
Okay.
So, as I say, from my point of view, if I was assuring that, one of the things I would say is, I'm assuring that for as long as you only use that hardware.
Yes.
So as I say, I think that's where the transparency comes in, of just being really clear and upfront about what this can and can't do.
Right. Yeah. So the audience for this assurance that you're providing, like one audience is the clinicians and other people within the NHS who might be using the system. So they know, what it's assured for, what particular use cases it's assured for, and when it should be kind of safe and so on. But another audience, I suppose, is patients and the public, right? Yeah. So how do you kind of communicate with patients and the public, and what kind of message are you trying to give to them when you're saying that a system is assured? Yeah,
sure. So, I mean, typically we're a few steps removed from that front line. So typically for a large project, you would probably have a delivery board. So you would have a group of people who take the decision to say, yes, we can switch this on or not. And so we would inform them. We'd be alongside people like clinical safety, cybersecurity. So we'd all have input into that.
Right.
So I suppose that the big tick to give people confidence would be that board has looked at all of our inputs and said, yes, that's okay to go. As I say, we would attach a whole bunch of caveats to that to say it needs to be in these specific ways. I think, to be fair, I think we've got a bit of an advantage in healthcare and the public sector in that we can just be fully transparent. So we can just say that is what that is, and be really clear about it. I think in the commercial space, it's a lot harder. If you're trying to sell your system, it's potentially more challenging to be transparent. The classic example then is self-driving cars. So why don't we all have self-driving cars yet? And it's these edge cases of what do you want it to do in this particular rare scenario?
Yes.
And so, the idea of if the AI driving the car is faced with a choice between I either choose choice A, which will potentially harm the driver of the vehicle, or I choose choice B, which is to plough into this group of school children.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you would say, okay, surely the harm to the driver is the lesser evil. Okay. However, if you're the car manufacturer, that puts you in a position of trying to sell a car wherein you're saying this car might choose to kill you.
Yes.
So how do you do that? So in the commercial space, I think it's more difficult to be upfront about the limitations and risks of your product.
Yeah.
I think for us in healthcare and the public sector, that's easier because that is literally our job, to be fully transparent and upfront about it.
Yes. Okay. Great. So you are testing these AI systems to provide assurance. So one of the things I was wondering is you've given some examples of the kinds of issue that you might be looking for, but I wonder, how do you know that you're looking for the right things? Because I suppose the problem with this is that the potential problem is that you test for a range of things and then something just comes up that you hadn't anticipated.
Absolutely, yeah. So those software testing qualifications that I mentioned before, there's a couple of key principles in there,
right?
That kind of feed into this. So there's a concept called the pesticide paradox. So that is, if you're applying pesticide to crops, if you just use exactly the same pesticide year after year after year, what you actually end up with is, you kill 99% of your pests, but that 1% that it doesn't kill thrive, and so your pesticide becomes less and less effective over time. So the analogy here is, if we just perform exactly the same suite of tests every single time, the developers that we're working with, quite rightly and naturally, they know what we're going to test, so they make sure that those bits are right. And so over time, you'll miss things. Okay. So the pesticide paradox says, every time you're doing the testing, you should kind of try and look at it fresh. You should mix it up and change it. So you should choose very specifically what to test. The second principle then is that exhaustive testing is impossible. So it isn't possible to test absolutely every possible thing that might happen, partly from a practical point of view, but also from the point of view of, that would assume that you've thought of everything, So that basically says you also have to think about what you're not testing. Okay, so in combination, what that means is that every time you come to an assurance project, you have to explicitly choose what to test and not test. So the two things there are, number one, we use what we call a risk-based approach. And so everything is driven by a level of risk. So if we're making those decisions, that's how we would prioritize it, in terms of saying, okay, well, we have to test that because if that went wrong, this would be the impact. Equally, there might be other things where you'd say, okay, actually, relatively confident in that already, and the impact of that bit going wrong is relatively minor. So perhaps that doesn't need as much focus. So you take a risk-based approach to it. But also, the second thing is that we wouldn't look at these things in isolation. This should be a cyclical process. So you should learn from the last time you tested this system or a similar system. Okay, yeah. And so we shouldn't be kind of just doing a piece of work and then forgetting about it. It's a continual learning process of learning from equivalent or similar systems and building up that knowledge. That's one of the challenges initially with AI, because it's relatively new. We don't have a wealth of historic information to draw on, but we're already kind of rapidly building that up, basically. Right. And as I say, AI has that safety net as well, of particularly for the clinical side, of we're never going to ask it to make a decision on its own anyway.
Right. So, okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. I suppose one of the issues here is that you're testing systems that aren't static, right? So it's not like you can kind of assure something when it's first implemented and then it's fine. Absolutely. Because these systems are learning and changing, and they might develop biases or ethical issues that they didn't have to start with.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's a really key point. So there are some AIs that do learn. Yeah. So there are some AIs that are designed to change themselves and to learn over time. Actually, most of the AIs that we've spoken about today wouldn't do that. The AI itself is static. However, the behavior can still change over time because the data coming into it can change over time.
Right.
So the example that we often use for that is if you imagine that you had an AI in 2019 that was working really, really well, totally static, it's not learning, it's just doing its job, it's performing really well, and then COVID. Never seen that before, didn't train it for that.
Yeah.
So suddenly it's potentially going to start behaving differently because it's encountering something new.
It's a black swan event or something.
Yeah,
like that.
exactly. Yeah. Just we couldn't have predicted it. So yeah. So that is an issue.
Yeah.
So the way my projects approached that is that for a traditional system, we would issue what we call an assurance statement. So that is just a static document that says, yes, this is assured. And so until you change that, it's good for as long as you use it. And if you change it, then we'd reassure it.
Right.
Can't do that for AI for exactly the reason you just said. So instead of having a static assurance statement, we've developed what we call dynamic assurance criteria. And so what we do is we apply conditions to say, okay, so this system is assured for as long as it continues to meet these criteria. And so there's two types of those. So one is a kind of just a binary thing of saying, for as long as you don't change any of these things. So like, for as long as you use that hardware. If you get a brand new scanner made by a totally different company, then we need to look at it again.
Yeah.
So there's that. The other one then is continual monitoring. So like with the readmission predictor that we looked at, we said, okay, well, for as long as you're using it just on that particular group of people, as long as those are the people that are coming into your A&E, this is fine. However, we expect you to continually monitor those people, which they do anyway. They capture that information anyway. And as soon as you see a change in your population, then this is no longer assured and we need to look at it again. So, the concept of what we call newly emerging communities. So if you have a particular wave of immigration from a particular place, maybe suddenly there's now a community of these people who weren't there before. As soon as you start seeing that, then our assurance automatically stops and needs to be revisited. So so it is more. It's more complicated and takes more effort, but it's necessary because, as you say, it's going to change. And from my point of view, as the guy literally signing the piece of paper, I need to be I'm really aware of the fact that I'm saying yes, you can use that, but as you say, next week or next year, it might start behaving differently. Yeah. If I haven't put these conditions in place, I've still assured it, right? I'm still on the hook for it. Yeah.
Okay, right. Thank you. Oh, we're nearly out of time, but I just wondered if you could give an idea of what you think the future is like for AI in healthcare, because you've kind of said that it's fairly early days at the moment. I suppose one thing that people might be thinking is, well, is this, are AI systems going to be replacing clinicians and, people are going to be out of a job? Do you think that's something that we need to worry about?
Right, yeah. I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest headline issues, isn't it, of AI is taking jobs. So I think from my point of view, I do not think, I can't see AIs replacing clinicians anytime soon. Because we can't say for sure how it's making its decisions. There has to be a human in the loop. So in terms of clinical AI, as I say, I think they can be hugely helpful in terms of productivity, in terms of giving clinicians information that they wouldn't have had before. But there's always going to be a human in the loop. In terms of the administrative AIs, I mean, feasibly, yes. So, for example, the AI that I mentioned earlier that would moderate reviews from patients, that's, moderation is something that was traditionally, that was something that a person would do. Mm-hmm. A person would read that review and, so there is potential there, I suppose. I guess just, my own personal opinion, so not representing NHS England, but just my own view on that is I don't think that necessarily has to be a bad thing. I think it really depends on what you do with it. So if we say we've got an AI that increases productivity because it can do something much quicker and save us loads of time, all the people that were doing that job, it's what do you do with those people? So, if there's two scenarios, you could have a scenario where you say, all right, we don't need them anymore. Okay. So what that gives you is you're effectively getting the same service you've got now, but it's cheaper. So you've saved some money, but you haven't progressed. It's not improved. It's just cheaper. The alternative is to say, okay, I've now got a bunch of people that I can deploy to do other work. Because there is no shortage of work to do in the NHS, right? Yeah. So actually, you could look at it another way and say, okay, what I can now do is actually get lots more work out of the same number of people.
Yeah.
So that's the choice of going, okay, should we just stay as we are, but it costs less, or should we pay the same amount of money but actually get lots more work?
And, essentially higher quality work, I suppose, because you're deploying human operatives where human operatives really are needed. And the stuff that can be done by the AI.
Absolutely, So do you want the same for cheaper, or do you want more for the same amount of money? For my personal opinion is that the latter is better because it improves the quality of the service without extra spend. So I think really that the crux of that question about AI taking jobs and stuff is not actually a technology question.
Right.
It's not the nature of the technology, it's the nature of the economic system within which it sits.
Okay. Interesting. Great. I mean, there's loads more things I could ask you, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. But just to say, Adam Byfield, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time, and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.